Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Stenka Piskulic. I am the president of REDLAC, which is the Latin American Caribbean Network of Environmental Funds. And I'm also co-chair of the Environmental Funds Working Group of the Conservation Finance Alliance, CFA. And this Environmental Funds Working Group, which was established in 2007, is now comprised of 122 members from 33 countries. And its mission is to encourage the promotion of the knowledge transfer and exchange among environmental funds and relevant donors and NGOs as well. As part of the work that we're doing in the Environmental Funds Working Group, we are promoting the knowledge sharing in terms of the use of practice standards. As you know, last year, these practice standards for conservation trust funds were updated, and they now contain greater depth. And part of what we want to do is have a series of webinars on a monthly basis where we deep dive into each one of these practice standards to give us all an opportunity to really understand what these practice standards look like in actual practice. So as you know, we already had our first webinar last month where we had an overview of how these practice standards were updated. And today we are going to start deep diving into some of these standards. So today's webinar is focused on program's core area and the monitoring and evaluation cross-cutting theme. And I'm very honored to have three wonderful speakers who will join us today. Amilcar Guzman, who's partner at Wolf's Company, which was one of the companies that supported the creation and updating of these practice standards. And Pia Pavi, who's conservation manager at the Forever Costa Rica Association, who will give us perspective from a conservation trust fund. And then Paulina Arroyo, who's adaptive management and evaluation director at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and who's also part of the board of the Conservation Measures Partnership, who will comment on the use of standards from a donor perspective. The idea is then that we will be able to have a more theoretical view, a practical view from the point of view of conservation trust funds, and then the view also from the donor perspective today. Each one of our panelists will have 10 minutes to give us a deep dive into their work regarding monitoring and evaluation tools. And after that, we will open it to questions and answers. For those of you who are now joining us, please share your name, your country, and organization in the chat box so that we have a better idea of who is joining us. I know many are still joining as we speak. And also, please feel free to use the questions and answers section in your Zoom to ask questions for the panelists. These questions will all be answered at the end. So we will have the three presentations first and then deep dive into the questions. So with that, I would like to first leave you with Amilcar Guzman to give you the introduction in terms of the importance of this specific practice standard. Amilcar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stenka. So I'm sharing my presentation in a second. I think you can probably see it now. So, well, as Stenka introduced, well, I'm a partner at Wolf's Company, and I was part of the team that facilitated the update of the practice standards together with Aligning Visions. And well, I'm honored to be part of this panel today. We have two other wonderful panelists. And I will be giving the content overview and presenting some of the results of the 10-year review of conservation trust funds that relate to these areas, so to the program's core area and monitoring and evaluation cross-cutting theme. So just to start, for those who have used the standards, this is probably you already know that the practice standards, the 2020 version, have 7 core areas. And today we will be focusing, well, on programs in particular as one of the core areas. And one of the main changes, if you joined the previous webinar, you might know already, you might be aware of some of the main changes with respect to the previous version, the 2014 version. And you might know that the programs area comes from the 2014 operation standards. The operation standards included also some other aspects of operations and that were divided in two because of the importance of making grant making more explicit. And that's what's included in the program's core areas. I will explain in a second. So there are 12 standards in the program's core area that focus on this specific aspect of grant making. They also include some key issues on grant cycle management, for example, from the definition of clear guidelines and procedures to the requirements that are presented to grantees. Then another aspect that's included in the program's area are the other expenditures to achieve Conservation Trust Fund mission. So that could be, for example, capacity building among grantees, among others. And finally, monitoring and evaluation, which I will describe in more detail as part of the cross-cutting theme. Now, what is new in this program's core area? If you were using the 2014 practice standards, maybe you might be familiar with most of the practice standards in this area. So you might, when you see the table of contents, you might realize that many of them will be familiar to you because they were previously included in the operations, among the operation standards and the reporting, monitoring and evaluation standards. And you can find the exact changes in Annex 4. So this is just a reminder. Please go to Annex 4 if you want to see the changes. But just to highlight a few of the main changes with respect to the previous version, there are some changes in wording, in emphasis that is put in some specific aspects. And for example, the acknowledgement of the fact that conservation trust funds have impacts that go beyond nature conservation. So, and that's something that we also recorded in the 10-year review of conservation trust funds. So for the wording now incorporates sustainable development and climate action, for example. Then another very important aspect that was included across the different core areas is the use of technology. And in this particular case of the programs area, it refers to, for example, the use of online platforms to facilitate access to resources or to funding from CTFs among grantees. And finally, another key aspect that was incorporated into this version was the use of feasibility assessment. So the recommendation of these feasibility assessments when CTFs explore new areas, because another development that we have seen, that we have recorded, is that CTFs have expanded their areas of work. And now CTFs, for example, look at impact investing or partnerships with private sector and feasibility assessments are fundamental to make sure that a conservation trust fund does not embark in an area that will not generate the expected results, of course. So that's for the program's core area. Now, in terms of, in addition to the core areas, there are cross-cutting themes. And today we're looking at monitoring and evaluation in particular. There are 4 cross-cutting themes. And you can find all of them in Annex 3, if you're interested in one in particular. Now, monitoring and evaluation is, of course, fundamental for programs and grant making, but it's also very important for other areas of work, such as institutional effectiveness, resource mobilization, and risk management and safeguards. So there are monitoring and evaluation standards in all of these core areas. And of course, in Annex 3, you can find exactly which ones. Now, in terms of content, I believe that this will be perhaps self-explanatory for many of you, because if you are in this webinar, you probably know already a little bit about monitoring and evaluation. But just a few aspects to emphasize that are also emphasized in the practice standards is the importance of monitoring and evaluating results or progress with respect to goals and objectives. So what you have in your strategies, in specific plans, in your theory of change, etc. And reporting to specific audiences. So these are key issues that are highlighted in the practice standards as well. Now, and this is something that we also saw as a very important aspect in the results of the survey that we implemented in parallel to the update of the practice standards. So now I will present a few results that show the importance of these practice standards and the room for expanding the use of them. So in parallel to the update of the practice standards, we implemented this survey that was answered by 50 CTFs, which is around 50% of existing CTFs globally. And one of the results was that more than 70% of CTFs have been requested to monitor their programmatic impacts by donors. So this really emphasizes the importance of having clear practice standards in this subject, in these areas. Now, a very positive aspect is that CTFs have used the practice standards, the 2014 version. Around 70% of CTFs have used them. However, a much smaller percentage have used them to improve their grant-making processes or to design and revise monitoring and evaluation systems. So there is a big room here for a stronger use of the standards among CTFs. Now, also, if we look at results, for example, we reviewed as well annual and evaluation reports published by CTFs, and we found that less than 50% of CTFs publish their annual and evaluation reports, which is another area to improve, and following the practice standards, of course. Then when we looked at these annual and evaluation reports that were published by conservation trust funds, we also found a few other areas of improvement in terms of quality of the reporting. And here I present just a couple as examples for the discussion. Something I mentioned before, the importance of linking programmatic impacts or reporting to baseline data. Only a little bit more than 40% of CTFs that publish their reports mentioned baseline data, and a much smaller number provided further details on their baselines. And the results are a bit, so the numbers are even smaller when we looked at the strategic documents. If they link their reporting to strategic documents, meaning their strategies, plans, etc., or to specific goals and targets, theory of change, etc. Only 9 CTFs mentioned these documents or linked, and even a smaller number linked them and provided more details on it. So this is another area that hopefully will be strengthened, and hopefully the practice standards will encourage CTFs to do more work on it. And finally, just the last result I will present to then give the floor to the other panelists is in terms of indicators, which is a topic that it's widely discussed within the conservation community, and it's a very challenging topic, the use of adequate indicators. A good news here is that most CTFs, at least the ones that publish their reports, use outcome and output indicators in their reporting. Now, there are not necessarily standard indicators that are very common for them. Here, there are a few examples of the most simple ones and the ones that many CTFs use. And then here, the main challenge has been in measuring long-term contributions towards national or international targets. So how conservation trust funds link their conservation results to, for example, sustainable development goals, and whether they use appropriate metrics. Many CTFs mention sustainable development goals or have mentioned Aichi targets, but only a few have been able to measure their progress in relation to this. So hopefully the practice standards will encourage some CTFs to do more work on this, and this is what I wanted to share today. And I will then pass it on to Zdenka to introduce the other panelists.
Thank you, Amilcar. Thank you for that wonderful summary, because I think it also exemplifies specific areas in which conservation trust funds can continue to work and share experiences. And that is the whole purpose of these webinars, that we can learn from good examples that can then be replicated in order to increase those standards, the quality of the standards. So now I would like to invite Pia Pavi, who's conservation manager at the Forever Costa Rica organization, to share the experience of Forever Costa Rica in implementing these specific monitoring and evaluation tools. Pia, the floor is yours. Pia, you're still in mute, please.
Good, yes. Thank you, Zdenka, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar Forever Costa Rica will be the case that I'll be showing here in terms of monitoring and evaluation and how we implement those practice standards. As Amilcar was mentioning, the updated version of the practice standards that have those 7 core areas, we do work on these highlighted in green that are the cross-cutting areas where we implement monitoring and evaluation. Particularly, as some of you might be aware, Costa Rica, Forever Costa Rica was created to support the Costa Rican government in achieving the CBD goals under a public-private alliance that started in 2010. 10 years later, in 2020, we made an impact evaluation of those 10 years. It wasn't very easy to do because, as Amilcar mentioned, in those days, there wasn't a baseline database. There wasn't data there that we can, so we had to create a theory of change that reflected what was thought to be the situation in 2010. So from those learning experiences, we designed the institutional strategic plan with a 2030 vision and a 5-year strategic plan. Those learning experiences were also incorporated in what we call the Forever Costa Rica program that also has a plan for the next five years. And as Amilcar also mentioned, in this case in particular, it is very strongly linked to the theory of change of the CBD that you might be familiar with, that it's got the 2050 goals, it's got 2030 milestones, and the main focus of this, of these decades will be to work on reducing threats or working on the drivers of biodiversity loss. So for the Forever Costa Rica program, its theory of change developed, it was developed in more detail, and as you see, the normal thing that people are used to is looking at inputs in terms of human resources, tools, technological platforms, other stakeholders, and funding. And this will turn into a series of outputs or deliverables or products like we normally use these terms for. And in Costa Rica, what we do is to work on 3 main components that will generate effects. So it's the effectiveness of managing protected areas like we see here, and how the representativeness of biodiversity is present in protected areas. And we highlight climate change in particular because it is generating a series of threats for the marine and oceanic environments. Together, summing up all of these, they are contributing to increasing the ecological integrity of ecosystem functioning. Yes. Going down to more specifics, that component of representativeness is linked to target number 2 in the CBD, and it is then separated into work of 3 main priorities: biodiversity in inland aquatic ecosystems, coastal marine ecosystems, and oceanic ecosystems. And then in each one of those lines, there are a series of indicators that are simple as number of protected areas or newly created areas that are increasing the conservation of Costa Rica. But then there are others that are incorporated related to the participation of communities and indigenous peoples. The other component that has a strong work or a lot of work is linked to target number 1. And this one in particular is receiving a lot of funding. This is the one, and it's got a baseline in some of them. Not all of them have baselines as we speak, but they are working on generating the baseline. So hopefully in a few years, we will have something to compare with. This is the simple part where there's management plans. And then this part where we focus almost 80 or 85% of the effort will be directed towards addressing drivers of biodiversity loss, particularly through the use of spatial planning system in terrestrial areas, as well as in coastal marine areas. For these two, there are also indicators, and it is through this component where the linkage of indicators coming from the climate change convention or achievement of goals in Costa Rica and sustainable development, that this is the window of opportunity. The last one is climate change, and this one is linked to target 7, where it is prioritized to work on ecosystem-based adaptation strategies, not necessarily mitigation or disaster risk reduction, but on adaptation of coastal areas, marine coastal areas. So if we look at this in general, I would say that we're all familiar, and that is the easy part, to design strategic instruments, action plans, goals, targets, and we're all very familiar with that. However, how to actually get these to be an operational part of an NGO like ours has been the difficulty. You cannot wait 5 years to start thinking about how the information is going to be gathered, how the information is going to be stored, and how we're going to be interpreting those results. Biodiversity loss is very, very quick. It goes too fast for us to be waiting like that. It has to be an ongoing process. So what we have done right now in the process of designing our grant agreements, in the case of the program of Forever Costa Rica, there's about 70 to 80 projects a year that we're managing and designing. So there are formats for monitoring all these indicators, and they're included into the grant agreements with the NGOs that are our main strategy to get these outputs and outcomes to move towards the achievement of those goals. However, not with the formats, it's actually not enough. You can do that. But the main thing is the online technological platform that we're finishing this year. And this is a tool that will facilitate the communication between those that are generating the information that will be feeding into the indicators as the information is recollected. We can use it internally to measure the institutional effectiveness, and we can use it to communicate with the government to be able to monitor and see how we're moving towards the achievement of those goals that they have. And most importantly, I think was the last thing that Amilcar mentioned, is the communication with the donor community using the interpretation of these results. Thank you very much. I don't know whether it was 10 minutes or it's...
That was perfect timing, Pia. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about how this process has been constructed over the past 10 years and where it's headed now. So for everyone who has specific questions for Amilcar, for Pia, and later for Paulina, please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll make sure that these questions are all answered for you. So now I would like to give the floor to Paulina Arroyo to share her experience from a donor perspective and also as a member of the Conservation Measures Partnership, which of course inspired a lot of the work behind the practice standards. Paulina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zdenka, and everyone, and Pia and Amilcar, the wonderful presentations. I'm going to share my screen. Is that visible? Okay. So yes, thank you. I'm Paulina Arroyo from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And today I want to share with you a little bit how, first an overview of the Moore Foundation for those of you who are not familiar with who the foundation is and our guiding principles. And then I'll go into a very broad summary because we don't have much time. So this is really a crash course 101 on what the conservation standards are. And then I'll give an example of how at the Moore Foundation we have been using those standards as a reference, but in the framework of adaptive management. And then I'll end with a few recommendations for CTFs that actually coincide a great deal with what Almirka has presented and Pia. So just to give a very quick intro for those who are not familiar with the Moore Foundation, Gordon and Betty Moore established the foundation in 2000, 21 years ago, as a way of giving back to society to tackle large and important issues at scale where we can achieve significant and measurable impact. And the reason I wanted to share that with you is because measurable impact has been at the core of the foundation's work since its inception and is very important for the founders. But I'm going to unpack that a little bit because it's certainly an aspiration, but it's also been a great deal of learning and challenges along the way. We have four areas of focus: the science program, the environmental conservation program, a patient care program in the San Francisco Bay Area. And for today, I'm going to concentrate on the environmental conservation program. Within the environmental conservation program, we have three large initiatives and one special projects area that's managed directly by the chief environmental program officer. And each one of the initiatives has its strategic framework and its own budget. So all of our grant making for environmental conservation basically are housed within these four realms of initiatives and programs. But how is it that we decide what to fund? I get asked that quite a bit. And we do have four guiding principles that are essential to all the programs within the foundation. And this was set by our founders, Gordon and Betty, many years ago. And so this is, for us, sort of our guiding standards and our guiding principles. The first question we always ask, is it important? Now, of course, in environmental conservation, everything is important, and we can certainly argue that all the issues need to be addressed. But from a Moore Foundation point of view, the question revolves around if by addressing a certain issue, that project or a series of projects will result in large positive benefit. And then second, we also ask, can we make an enduring difference? These two questions are linked because we want to know if significant enduring impact can be achieved with our support and if it's important for us to be involved in those efforts. And then third, is it measurable? We need to track progress and confirm the outcomes that we've set out, but we also need to measure against those outcomes and goals that we've established. This is difficult, we know, but it is key for our quantitative and strategic approach to philanthropy. And fourthly, does it have a portfolio effect? We value synergy among grants to increase impact and also decrease risks. This requires promoting alliances among organizations or often ensuring that projects do not work in isolation. So the portfolio effect is definitely a key, what we call filter, but it's really a key criteria. I want to reinforce two concepts that are also important for us. One is adaptive management, because we feel the concept itself reinforces an approach and a framework where monitoring and evaluation is one element, but it's not the only element. So we believe it's critical to manage complexity and uncertainty. Adaptive management becomes a tool for managing this type of uncertainty in environmental conservation projects. because we always need to adapt to changing circumstances, but we also need to be tracking and learning at the same time. So it's a very iterative process. There's no silver bullet in conservation. So how do we really know if we're doing the right things? And that's something that we constantly ask ourselves in the conservation community. So adaptive management allows us to measure along the way, learn, and as I mentioned, adapt the decisions as we need it. Then how do we know if we are doing them well and achieving impact? Those are also key questions to constantly ask ourselves. And so we use tools and systems to facilitate the learning to answer these questions, especially to understand where we are going. And if things go wrong, we can stop, assess, and adapt. Another key concept is evidence-based approach. Many of you have probably read, it's become very common to talk about evidence-based conservation or an evidence-based approach to planning for conservation. We are using this concept very explicitly in our grant making, because now conservation organizations do have access to much more information and data and technology and sources than, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But sometimes we're not using these explicitly. So adaptive management and evidence-based approach requires that we seek the best available information to make decisions. It might not be the perfect information, it might not be everything that we need, but it's the most available to make decisions. And we use this information throughout. It's very important that this evidence be used throughout the process, and that you also understand that there will be differing levels of confidence. Also valuing what is quantitative information and what is qualitative information, that both are very important to make those decisions. So within that, the conservation standards, and I certainly encourage everyone to go in and dig much deeper into each one of these phases. The conservation standards for conservation has been a long-going process over the last 20 years, developed by several organizations, many, some of who are members on this call. And it basically encompasses in 5 broad steps, where you begin assessing, creating your team, defining your scope, and defining what is your problem assessment and your concept model. Then you plan, you establish your goals, your strategies, you have formulate a very clear theory of change, your results chains as well. And then you shift into implementing with a work plan, a timeline, a budget, to then analyze it and adapt and share. The last point being that you document the learning, to share it across the community for collaborative learning. And this process is iterative along the way. So it usually goes through one process, and every few years, organizations come back and revisit what they've learned and what they've assessed, and if they're meeting their targets. The conservation standards are implemented by many organizations around the world, as you can see. And I just want to highlight the Latin America and Africa for REDLAC and CAFE and the Caribbean. You know, many organizations in your countries are probably actively implementing the conservation standards. So there's certainly a good cohort of learning that can be done in each region. And there seems to be a myth, perhaps from a few years ago, that conservation standards were only used for site planning or for one particular area. But there's been quite a bit of innovation on the methodologies and adaptation. So, you know, a little bit of myth busting here. The conservation standards you can use for ecosystems, for instance, coral reefs. It can be used to plan out conservation projects for a species, but it can also be used for high-level policy advocacy, such as the Sustainable Development Goals that were mentioned previously. And it could certainly be used by the conservation trust funds for your own strategic planning and conservation impact measuring. So the partnership that Zdenka mentioned is composed of several organizations that we've been working together now for several years, but it's basically a network very similar to REDLAC. We come together to learn from each other in a safe space of learning, both donors and conservation organizations. And through the work and the learning is that the conservation standards has now been adapted. And I would encourage all of you to look at the new 4.0 version and the websites that I can share later, because there really has been more innovation in a couple of years. So just to land a little bit more tangibly on how then we at the Moore Foundation have been using both the conservation standards, but adaptive management and other tools as a reference point for our work. And I'm going to use the Andes Amazon Initiative as a case study for this. The Moore Foundation began supporting work in the Andes Amazon Initiative in 2003 through grant making. And for those of you not familiar, the Amazon region is a large area, almost the size of the continental United States, composed of 9 countries. And at that time, the Moore Foundation began grant making in several of these countries, 7 of the 9 countries. And it was only later that we decided to focus on 12 mosaics. If you see the numbers here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 12 landscapes or mosaics across 5 countries. But there's also 4 drivers or corridors that we're looking at where the concentration of drivers of deforestation and drivers of habitat loss are concentrated. So that core strategy of focusing on creating protected areas, increasing their consolidation or management effectiveness, and consolidating also indigenous lands, that has really been the core of the project of this initiative. And so this relates to how we assessed with the information that we had at that time. And every 5 years, the team goes to the board to have approval for this. So I just want to focus on one part of our strategy, which is the protected areas and indigenous lands consolidation strategy. It's here that we're working at 3 different scales at the system of protected areas, for instance, like the system of protected areas in Costa Rica, or the system of protected areas in Peru. Mosaics, which are large landscapes composed of protected areas and indigenous lands. And then there's the individual unit. There's 142 conservation units, which are protected areas or indigenous lands across those 5 countries. So once we had approval from our board with a budget to begin implementing this program, we had already identified also indicators that we would be measuring at each one of these scales, at the systems for funding mechanisms and monitorings of protected areas, for the landscape or the mosaic, 5 durability factors, and 6 consolidation indicators to at least measure the management effectiveness of those individual areas over time. We are also tracking, because many of our partner organizations are tracking threats. And so we do track threats at the Amazon level and at the mosaic level, such as roads, expansion of agriculture, mining. And then we've also been tracking deforestation rates across the Amazon biome as a proxy for conservation health. So just to quickly go through, because I'm now running out of time. Once we started implementing this and we started gathering data from all our partners, we were using Excel to manage all the information. And as you can imagine, it started to become very cumbersome to use all this information that we were getting from the field from our partners in one place. And so in 2016, we began using Power BI, which is a Microsoft online platform, with online Excel tools to manage all the information and to generate a series of dashboards or reports that, as our program officers and the program directors and internally, we could use for our grant making. And this just basically helped us organize visually the data and access it and do queries for the questions that we wanted to answer, having very clear where our baseline is, the year of the status, and what our final target is, because we had also established targets of where we want to be. So this is just looking at the indicators of consolidation, which were 6 indicators, red being when it was very poor, condition for management effectiveness, and dark green being our aspirational, where we want to go. And so every year we could see how that was going. So we're also able to link this with maps on the Power BI. And so now we're able to sort of to visualize how we've been progressing through the grant making in all those 142 units of 5 countries. And just to give you a sense of a snapshot, in 2013, our baseline where we were 2016, there's been better advancement as we get towards a very good condition being dark green. And then in 2018, where we are now. So this use of technology of a platform with the data has really helped us to just concentrate our efforts on assessing, on learning, and then bridging a dialogue with our grantees on how we're advancing and reaching our outcomes. So I see this as an opportunity for the conservation trust funds, an opportunity for you to use adaptive management as that framework, to adapt the tools that are promoted within the conservation standards. And if you go in, you'll see there are several different tools that you could probably use that will help you implement this forward-looking vision document that you have. Be very explicit about the learning from the practice and learn from each other. And then putting the systems in place for decision-making, that has been very key for us. This is something that we are ongoing to put the systems in place for the decision-making to make adaptive management a much more agile process and reach all the different audiences that we need within the foundation and outside. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulina. That was an excellent example, and it's amazing to see how an organization has the capacity to measure the collective impact from a series of grantees from different parts around the world and put them together in a single. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions and interest in understanding more about how that tool actually works. We already have 3 questions online. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to use the Q&A section. And make sure that these are questions that are directed to, let us know who you want to direct these questions to. So I will start with the first question, which is actually, I believe, for Paulina. And it says, how do you balance the demands for detailed reporting that can be standardized and shared up through the CTF networks and donors with, 1, the time demands that this has on grantees, and 2, the need for locally identified indicators?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question, and that's something that has been evolving within the foundation, and we keep improving. Something that has definitely helped is by having a strategic framework, because since our practice is strategic philanthropy, each initiative has a strategic framework with clear outcomes, a theory of change. And we proactively look for the organizations for which we can build alliances with to implement those strategic plans. But there is always this careful balance between what the foundation has set forth as outcomes that is based on information and expert opinions in the field, but then also what organizations prioritize and what you need. So once you get to the level of an actual grant, which is probably the smallest unit of analysis within this broader framework, it's a question then of dialogue and negotiation as to what is really the part that will be funded, and the organization is held accountable for that funding in the grant, but then also what the organization has within its own strategic plan, and it could be measuring. So for instance, in the Andes Amazon initiative, we decided to streamline 6 indicators of consolidation for those individual units. But many other organizations had other indicators. As many of you know, management effectiveness indicators are plenty out there. And so the organizations are certainly free to keep tracking that, but we would only request that we concentrate on those 6, which to us were just basic vital signs for moving forward. So I don't think there's really a black and white answer to that, but there's certainly a practice now to try to streamline and be more explicit about what you're asking to measure that's directly related to the theory of change and your outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much, Paulina. Here's a question for both Amilcar and Pia. So the first part of the question is, from the resource level, personnel and finance in particular, how much are funds spending? Amilcar, from the studies that you did, is there any information on how much funds are actually spending on monitoring and evaluation? And how much are donors willing to support these efforts? And maybe in that question for Pia, if you can give us an example from one conservation trust fund, the level of investment that the conservation trust fund has in terms of personnel and finance in particular to have one of these programs up and running. So we can start with Amilcar and move to Pia, please. Okay,
thank you. Yeah, so that's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for the amount of funds that were spent in monitoring and evaluation. That's not something that we analyzed in detail. We did have interviews with a number of donors, and well, there is always a percentage of funding that's when there are fund requests by CTFs, made by CTFs, or when donors approach CTFs to contribute with some amounts. It is common practice that a certain amount is spent in monitoring or is saved for monitoring and evaluation. Now the percentages vary wide among CTFs, and something that was mentioned in many cases was in the interviews with donors was that in many cases was not a common practice to ask for a specific amount for an evaluation. So that's something that CTFs have been learning over time as well. So hopefully it will continue to develop in that area. And yeah, so for now, specific figures we don't have from the 10-year review at least.
Thank you, Amilcar. How about from the perspective of a conservation trust fund, Pia? How much investment is this in terms of time, money, staff?
Well, it is an investment that has to be a continuous effort. And when you make these stops of impact evaluations every 5 years or every 10 years, and there's an injection of at least $50,000 to $60,000 to evaluate a program, and that should be incorporated into the design, the financial design of the funds available for conservation. In terms of the institution as a trust fund, every year you need to incorporate a line that's dedicated to monitoring and evaluation, because it is, as Paulina was saying, it's a live thing, and you learn constantly and you make mistakes all the time, and you have to redesign your modules, and then the technological platform is not probably the best to interact with our project ejecutores, executors, and I think you need to think of at least 15 to 20,000 a year as a minimum, plus on top of that's without thinking of the human resources, and all our technical expertise are involved in analyzing the indicators and the metrics and the interpretation at least, once every 3 months. We generate dashboards that at the moment they are financial dashboards used as proxies, but we're moving into the technical area, and that's at least one person should be dedicated to manage the technological platform with the support of everybody else.
Okay, thank you very much, Pia. And we have another question here from Meredith Ryder. And it says, question specifically on collecting indicator results from projects that are implemented at a community level. So what are some effective approaches for collecting both quantitative and qualitative outputs and outcomes? I think that's a question we're always asking ourselves, right? So some recommendations on that. And she says there's often a disconnect between those at the headquarter level and the implementers at the community level. So at the headquarter level, it's a focus is more on fundraising, the desire to tell good stories with impacts and results. But at the community level, it's more focused on operations in order to deliver benefits and grant commitments. So what advice do you have for designing tools that can actually integrate both of these, monitoring and tracking, more holistically so that they can be more easily done throughout the life cycle of a project? And are there some type of technology that we can use to do this? So before I pass this on, to whoever wants to tackle this question, whether it's Paulina, Pia, or Amilcar, or if you all want to integrate some of your experience, both from the donor perspective and the CTF level. Also, just to let you know that we will have a webinar on July 20th, which will be focused specifically on technology, which is one of these new practice standards as well. So a lot of what we're seeing today, we will also see reflected in the webinar that we will have on July 20th on technology. So now with that very difficult question, actually, I would like to ask one of you if you're willing to tackle that question, Paulina, Pia, or Amilcar? Paulina, thank you.
Yeah, no, certainly this is a great question and not probably also one simple answer, but there's a few examples I think and also there's scales of information and audiences. So for us as a foundation, we certainly rely on our partners in the field to gather the information from their local community partners in a way that is best culturally acceptable for them. So sometimes it could be in workshops, through flip charts, more manually, or through storytelling. So there's a variety of tools that our partners are using to gather the information. But there's also a great example that a Wildlife Conservation Society has been exploring using an app to gather information about fish migration across the Amazon. And so I think that's a really great example of generating a broad network across several countries using a mobile app that they designed to gather indicators or information on indicators of fish health and other water, like river properties, across large landscapes, and using a technology that most people now have access to. And the app works offline as well, so you don't necessarily depend on always being connected to the internet. So I think now with definitely technology and a little bit more innovation, there's possibilities to gather more real-time information.
Thank you. Pia or Amilcar, would you like to add something to that response? Pia, please.
Yes, I think that what people struggle with is actually the fact that you have all these projects that are working at the local community level or at the individual protected area, and that's where the design of your grant agreement and the design of an easy mechanism for these project managers to interact and feed the information into this technological platform. I think that the next step, scaling up, where you're using this many dots of information and generating an indicator of effect, that's usually an analytical that incorporates indexes or formulas or much more complex ways of showing your information. And I think that Microsoft Power BI that Paulina showed is an example of that. And we are using something that we're designing in-house, and you can also use Smart, and there are many other tools to gather information, but the key question is how to actually convert this into indicators of effect and of impact.
Thank you. Amilcar, would you like to add something?
Yes, just very briefly, because I think what has been mentioned is of course the core of the answer. And building on what Paulina said, there is no one single answer, but I think something that we have seen in all the annual reports and evaluation reports that we reviewed was that simplicity is very important. So going back to the SMART model, start from the most simple indicators that will enable then integration, and then you can build on that and add more layers of complexity. I think that's of course fundamental, and something that we have seen as well in the review of what CTFs have been reporting on.
Perfect, thank you. There's a follow-up question here, I think, for what you have just been discussing, Paulina. So the comparative analysis of the grant tracking tools before opting for Power BI, is that something, what made you choose the solution? Is this something you'd be willing to share with some of the grantees?
Yes, no, gladly. We don't have anything necessarily documented, but we did grapple with the idea of what tools to use. Either, one extreme is to hire a programmer and design something that would be internally. That was rather cumbersome and expensive, and you would always be dependent on that design. And in the end, we decided on using basically what the Microsoft tools already have, because we already have a license for Microsoft. So it wasn't a huge investment to just buy an additional license for the Power BI. And it connects then to all the other Microsoft tools like Excel, PowerPoint, Word. And then we started using SharePoint. So now there's Microsoft and as others seem to be evolving a great deal on this online management. So you really don't have to go, as sometimes many organizations have opted for, having their own design internally. So that was just our decision to use Power BI. There are other data visualizations tools that you could explore. I think it's a question of answering what you want to know, what questions you need for the decision making, and what system is the most agile that will later be useful for you over the years.
Great, thank you. Pia, here's a specific question for you in just 1 or 2 minutes. Can you tell us, from the exercise that you just did in measuring the impact for the last 10 years, what are some interesting findings that you might want to tell us about that you found in that 10-year evaluation?
I think one of the most important impacts that the program achieved during those 10 years, in take into consideration that there wasn't a theory of change at the very beginning, but the most important impact was actually being able to use the governance models and community participation in the creation of newly designed and created areas for conservation. That was one of the main impacts, and particularly in the coastal and marine areas. Another impact that was identified was the fact that in those areas, protected areas that were receiving support for management, the impact is that it is now working completely. They're monitoring and evaluating their effectiveness. And in terms of conservation of those species, unfortunately, the measurement of ecological integrity is not yet implemented in the terrestrial areas, but it is in the coastal and marine ecosystems. So there are important impacts related to that. There were other learning experiences that said that with a different design of the grant agreements, you could have increased the results in a shorter time period. So that was really interesting for us as the administrator. It's a tool that, even though it can be gruesome, it's really important to do. You have to stop and think and analyze and adjust.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think that's a really great way to close this session. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There are a few other questions, but we will have to address them offline. We could have gone on for a long time. I wanted to close this session, first of all, by thanking Paulina, Amilcar, and Pia for joining us, for bringing such great presentations and giving us a little bit of a deep dive into what monitoring evaluation tools are about. And we will, of course, hear about monitoring evaluation throughout all the standards, because as Amilcar mentioned, it really is a cross-cutting theme. And just close also by adding this calendar of the next webinar series. The rest, we will be having one every month for the rest of the year. And so the next one is going to be on March 16th. And I think it's a really important topic, communications. It's definitely something that we can all relate to. And even what we were speaking about today requires very good communications with grantees, donors, and others. So I hope you can all join us for the next webinar, which we'll be hosting in March. And thank you to all the panelists for joining us today, and to the Conservation Finance Alliance for making this possible. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.